Good evening, and welcome to Week Three's group project for the Delta Group. That would be Terry Hervey, Clint Maddox, Keelan Logan, and I'm Josh Hamilton. In this project, we're going to look at some major differences in Eastern and Western philosophies, and specifically how that goes with education and the differences of the two philosophies with regards to education. And why this is important is because, well, when we look at the two differences, I mean, there are some vast differences. At the same time, I think you can find some similarities as we go along. And in the end, we hope you walk away with this knowing some differences about the two philosophies from the Eastern side and the Western, and how those apply to education, some of the differences within education. So let's begin. To begin, we can look at the development of Eastern and Western education philosophies. When we talk about the development, Eastern and Western philosophies, they develop both from religious beliefs. The Western side viewed that education's purpose is to get a better job and move up the social ladder, very materialistic, what we all kind of know about. However, the Eastern view of education's purpose is to develop one's inner being, to look at the self, and I think that's really important because that's a vast difference between the two. Western's view that there should be some separation of religion and government, while the Eastern view of government and religion are intertwined. So what we can see here from this first development of these educational philosophies is that the Eastern side developed more from the self and how that intertwines with religion and government, while the Western is more about like moving up this ladder in the material world and more of a separation. And so many of us will be more familiar, obviously, with the Western side of education, but we're going to point out some differences as we continue. So when we go to slide 2 and we look at teachers and respect, we can see that the Eastern approach of this with regards to education has the teacher occupying an important and central role in the development of the student. The teacher commands greater respect, more of an authority figure, etc. One can understand why the teacher is viewed by the way of looking at teachers such as Buddha, Confucius, Jesus, Muhammad. These great teachers of the time were looked at and revered by the community and by their students, and it was very important the teacher had all this respect. On the opposite side, when we look at Western education, it promotes students seeking out answers. While the teacher is definitely needed, we're more regarded in the Western side as being assistants to children in learning. So you can kind of see the major two differences there and how they kind of came about. Page 105 is the reference in the text on that, if you want to learn a little bit more, but that's like the basics of like with teacher respect. Now we go to the next slide, we can look at individualism versus collectivism. Religion plays a vital role in both sides of beliefs and philosophies. Western beliefs dating back 2,500 years ago, we can see pictures from Prometheus defying Zeus by creating humans before Prometheus when it was chained to a rock. Another example is from the book of Genesis that talks about dominion over the fish in the sea and over the fowl. Both of these are examples that reinforce the notion of the individual rights for all. That's really important. It's kind of a collectivism thought there, that we are all a part of this greater system. By comparison, though, the Chinese, according to Confucianism, says that we have obligations to serve the ruler, obligations to work for family, obligations to obey elders, and the list goes on. So this type of mentality promotes conservatism and self-introspect. So we can see that the teaching cognitive thought and the scientific method is more prominent in Western civilizations and then inner growth is, like that is for the Eastern. When we move down to the next slide, after talking about individualism versus collectivism, or the individual versus the whole, you can look at active versus passive learning. Western culture is much more submersed in this active learning education system. We're very active. We believe in this group work and these hands-on things. Many things people who are educators are probably doing in the classrooms now. However, the Eastern culture wants their students to be more passive learners. The teaching strategy in society is that basic teacher lecture, the students looked at as an empty vessel, and the educator should fill them with this knowledge. You can go back to the teacher respect slide and think about how, you know, we have one central figure that is giving us this information, as our Confucius, our Jesus, you know, these higher people in society that are viewed as educators. So there's kind of a difference between the active versus passive learning. On the next slide, you can look at the role of the student. In Western culture, students are given respect and rights within the learning process itself. Students are encouraged to find answers, and teachers facilitate the learning needs. Students are also given freedom to seek out the answers to their own problem. However, as stated earlier, in Eastern education, the students are looked to as that empty vessel. So it's not surprising to find the teacher giving them the answers to meet a learning requirement. Furthermore, students are held to a rigid set of rules and procedures. Some might argue this could hinder some self-growth and development of thought, and encourages more dependence on the teacher directly for their learning needs. And so when we look at this, it's pretty easy to note that the role of the student definitely differs. One is more of this active learning, go find the knowledge yourself, whereas the other is you're this empty vessel and let me fill you with the knowledge. The next slide you're looking at is understanding versus memorization. In Western cultures, students are pushed to develop some metacognition for learning. That is, students should be aware of what they know and what they need to improve in. In Western cultures, it can't be fulfilled through memorization, but by a deeper understanding of the curriculum. This is this higher level Bloom's kind of thinking. And on the other hand, though, Eastern philosophy prefers to cover mass amounts of information and memorization. Book learning is a key resource. We look at tests and memorization of facts and these types of things. So when we look at the two philosophies, we see that understanding and memorization definitely differ in Eastern and Western philosophies. In the Eastern philosophies, we see this very rigid memorize, whereas in the Western philosophy, we'd like to believe, at least, if we're not teaching to just a test, that we're understanding the material and going to this higher cognition. On the next slide, you're looking at some praises and some criticisms. When we talk about praise and criticism, Western culture encourages students even when they do not do well. Believing the encouragement motivates students, keeps them improving. You know, we give these rewards, not just internal rewards, we give them external rewards to keep things moving. Eastern cultures, students are criticized when they don't meet these expectations. There's a very high level of expectation needed here. And so when we look at this high level of expectation needed, it's really important to note that students are expected in Eastern cultures to do well. You have to do well. Whereas in Western, we just keep promoting to encourage. So that's kind of how we look at praise and criticism. And we got you a link down there about a paper where kind of that resource came from. But it's definitely different. And so you can see kind of those differences playing out, especially when we look at the whole. So when we go back over this in a recap, here on slide 8, you can see that the differences in Eastern philosophies of education. The major differences here, if we just look at these in two different terms, when we look at the Eastern side of things, which is not our familiarity, is that the teacher is the center of respect. The student is this empty vessel that we are supposed to fill, and they're criticized when they're not filled in doing these routine memorizations and meeting this high standard. Whereas in the Western side, we can see that educators are viewed as assisting, guiding, etc. And on the other side of this, in the same Western philosophy, that we use praise and encouragement, and you can do it type of strategies to help them develop this learning and to understand at a higher level. So in the end, you can see definitely some clear differences between these two. And so that's just our major recap as we look back over this. And as you can see, there are definitely some differences between Eastern and Western philosophy. In this final focus, we definitely want you to walk away with a few things. The first is that Eastern philosophy differs because it definitely looks at the inner self, but at the same time, with regards to education, the inner self has to, in some ways, be inferior to the teacher and become this empty vessel to gain this knowledge, and it has to meet this high standard. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Western society, as we noted, really pushes more the material world and getting to the top. And so we discover how to do that, and teachers are there to assist us in getting to this top that we're trying to reach through praise, hands-on learning, active learning, etc. So I hope that gives you a little bit more education